I would not claim to be a infant mental health specialist, although I've been an infant scientist for about going on 30 years. That's one issue that I think needs to be bridged, is the gap between infant mental health specialization and infancy science, because I don't think the two groups talk very much. Certainly, I know that the International Congress on Infant Studies doesn't really have much going on in the area of infant mental health at its biennial conference. So the learning objectives that I came up with for today, many months ago, before I put my talk together, which I would probably revise slightly if I were to present them, is I'm going to talk about two different conceptualizations of temperament that have emerged. There are more than two. I'm going to talk about two that I believe are the most popular. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we think children learn to talk, particularly how they learn to acquire words. And then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we have in measurement that psychologists have focused on in the last 20, 30 years. And then I'm going to talk about the literature linking temperament to language in very early children. So when I agreed to do this talk, I agreed to talk about my work. It's the work that I know best. So I'll be talking mostly about the studies that I've published, but there are other researchers out there doing this work, which supports what I find. So there's been a lot of replication. I just want to be clear, because I'm focusing on my work, doesn't mean I'm narcissistic. It just means that I know it better, and it's easier for me to talk about. So I want to start by a tale of two children. The first child is Rachel. Rachel is, in this picture, I guess about 2. Rachel is a very interesting child because of the cluster of temperamental characteristics that make up this child, all rolled up into one. Very high levels of negative reactivity. When something sets this child off, this child screams, goes off very intensely. This child is highly sensitive to stimuli, and by stimuli, I mean things like tags in her shirts, the stitching in her socks, in her diaper. The moment that she tinkled in her diaper, she would need to be changed because she couldn't stand the feeling of the moisture against her skin. The child would, when provided the opportunity to choose between two things, like 2 things on a menu, 2 items in a store, the child couldn't decide. And I describe it here as disabling, because the child would sometimes have a temper tantrum because she couldn't decide. And she knew she couldn't decide, and she got really upset that she couldn't decide, and sometimes would end up laying on her back in the store in a literal sort of stomping temper tantrum. It was really kind of sad, actually. The child, I use the term biological arrhythmia to describe that the child got sleepy different times each day, and for the parents mostly, the relevant thing here was the child would go to the bathroom at different times each day. Come back to the issue of biological arrhythmia later and why that matters. The child never slept. Well, it's not exactly true. The child slept, didn't have a sleep disorder, but the child was able to keep going for long periods of time. Many children will fall asleep in the car when you're going to the store, when you're going on a trip, and this child generally would stay awake through the whole trip, which is pretty unusual with young children. This was true from infancy through early childhood. But the child was also really attentive to the environment. The parents described this child as driving down the interstate in the US and seeing water towers off in the distance and pointing at them. In the most small water tower way off in the distance on the horizon, the child would see it and point, and the parents would notice it. Child's also super high in social anxiety, does not like new situations, hides behind the parents' legs. When strangers come into the room, the child might get extremely upset and leave the room because she's so frightened of the social situation, doesn't like new things. Likes things to be steady and safe. This child was identified as intellectually gifted in kindergarten during standard testing routines. And this child didn't really talk. This child sort of waited until she was close to 3 before she cared to talk. And I use the term in the the Northern American way. In the South, it turns out if you say, I don't care to do something, it means you don't mind doing it. In the North, it means that you don't want to do it. So I mean it in the sense that she didn't want to do it. She didn't really like to talk. Compare that with Sarah. Sarah in this picture is about 5. Sarah was easily soothed. She was easy to get along with. If new things happened, she went along with it just fine. It didn't bother her. This child was like, you didn't need to change the diaper for weeks. She would use the diaper, she would go to the bathroom in the diaper, and she didn't even notice. I mean, you really had to see it kind of falling off of her before you realized that you might need to change the diaper. So extreme insensitivity to stimuli, in contrast to Rachel, who had very high sensitivity. Sarah would play for hours with toys, particularly in front of musicals. She liked to watch musicals, and if you put a musical on TV, and she would sit and play when she was 2 and 3 years of age for hours at a time. So very self-engaging, self-regulating. You did not have to entertain Sarah. Very biologically regular. You knew when Sarah needed a nap. Would be it'd be the same time every day. You knew when she would need to go to the bathroom. You could plan your day around that. You wouldn't have to wait, you would have to wait if you knew when she was going to have to go to the bathroom at 5 o'clock. You could plan your dinner plans around that because it was so regular. There would be no surprises after leaving the house. Said that about Broadway musicals. Sarah was a social butterfly. She really enjoyed people. She liked new people in particular. She would engage people. She was a charmer when she was a child. And she was also intellectually gifted. Diagnosed intellectual, I don't know if you diagnosed intellectual giftedness, but she was recognized as intellectually gifted and provided special service. And Sarah was talking pretty much from birth. She was a gabber. She talked early, she talked often, and to this day is still talking nonstop. Sarah and Rachel are siblings. Okay, so they're sisters. Rachel is the older one, Sarah is the younger one, which implies 2 things. One is that they had the same biological parents. In this case, they did have the same biological parents. And they had the same basic child-rearing environments. And so they were so different, and yet they were so the same. Okay.
Back at the University of Maryland, infants are brought in at 9 months for the second assessment of the temperament study. This time, researchers want to measure the emotions of anger, joy, and fear, all aspects of temperament. First, Jack is allowed to play with a colorful toy. Then a transparent barrier is put between him and the object of his desire. He sees the toy, but can't reach it. No matter how frustrated Jack feels, he won't give up. And when he can't do it on his own, he tries to charm the researcher into helping him. Emily, also 9 months, is of a different temperament than Jack. It seems she's more laid back. She gives it 1 or 2 tries, but then gives up. And even when the researcher tries to entice her again, she can't be bothered.
My name is Zoe. How do you do?
Everyone knows that a puppet show makes children happy.
Who do we have here today? She's awfully cute.
During this part of the study, researchers want to draw joy from the babies.
What's your name, Emily?
Emily loves the puppets and even tries to join in on the action.
It's nice to see you here today. Are you having fun? Who do we have here today?
But when the researcher tries the same experiment on Jack, he finds the situation anything but joyful.
Zoe, how do you do?
His temperament is such that he's easily frightened, and he will have none of it. The minute the puppets are removed, he cheers up and is ready for more action. Next, researchers test the baby's reaction when something frightens them. Not surprisingly, Jack is shaken by the scary mask. So they bring on the clown mask. And this one really pushes him past his limit. But Emily is very interested. She finds the clown amusing and thinks it's just a continuation of the previous entertainment. As for the more ominous mask, she just takes it in stride and adopts a wait-and-see attitude. Why does Emily react differently from Jack?
Okay, so what that does, the whole point of that is to capture the range of variation that we describe as temperament. Let me start out by saying I did not enter the field of child development thinking that I would study temperament. In fact, when I first read about temperament, I thought it was fake news, as we say. I didn't believe it was a real thing, and I thought that I was pretty skeptical about its utility in explaining human behavior. So the fact that I'm here talking 30 years later about temperament from a scientific perspective goes to show how far I've come in thinking, understanding its value and using it as a construct, an explanatory construct. But when you say temperament to most people don't think about temperament the way that scientists who study temperament think about temperament. If you were to ask most people what temperament is, they would say something like this: temperamental, this is right out of the dictionary, marked by excessive sensitivity and impulsive mood changes, a temperamental child. Or unpredictable in behavior or performance, a temperamental computer. So it's like there's one dimension, you're temperamental or you're not. And it turns out that temperamental, or that temperament, is far more nuanced as a definition than that kind of definition or characterization leads you to believe. We want to know, for example, if you wanted to study this scientifically, is temperament defined as the presence or absence of characteristics? So if you have certain characteristics, you're temperamental, and if you don't have them, you're not temperamental? If so, which traits or characteristics are to be included in that definition? Is it just negative emotion? So if you have a lot of negative emotion, you are temperamental. Is it the intensity of the emotion? So if you have extreme blow-ups emotionally, whether those are negative or positive, is that to be characterized by as temperament? If you're going to say that temperament is defined as extreme negative, intense affective displays, does that imply that easygoing children have less temperament? And could you even, if so, could you go negative on a temperament scale? So if temperament is defined as more temperament you have, the more negative you are, then if you have less negativity, could you even go negative on temperament so that you have negative temperament? And that would imply that you're actually positive in your affective displays. So the word temperament really isn't used in the lay culture, among the lay public, in any sort of scientifically validated way. Oh, and then how do we measure temperament? The challenges of measuring temperament is how long? What's the time frame? Can you measure it at one moment in time? Could I get a glimpse of your temperament by bringing you into the laboratory and exposing you to clown masks, or holding your hands in one place so that you get frustrated? Or is temperament something that you have to have over long periods of time? Sort of like personality, you have to be consistent in your display of temperamental characteristics over time before that counts. And then who are the best observers? Can you count on mothers to be the observers? Can you count on teachers to be the observers, or scientists, or therapists? What are the rules for who are the best observers? I would say that the most popular method for measuring temperament today is through mother reports. And I'll have to read this. It doesn't come through very well for those of you in the back row. This is a person filling out a self-report, looking at a computer, and the first question is: dominant? Yes. Intelligent? Yes. Go-getter? Yes. Devastatingly attractive? Yes. Three exclamation points. The problem with self-reports are that they suffer from the same, the problem with self-reports of temperament are that they suffer from the same problems of any self-report, is that people may not be most attuned to their own characteristics. They may be biased in their understanding of their own characteristics, and so may not provide valid judgments. Also, people have suggested, critics of mother reports have suggested, that mothers' personalities are driving how they rate their children. So some parents, because they are themselves maybe attuned to certain kinds of temperamental characteristics, will be more likely to detect them in their children and so report on them, whereas other mothers are insensitive to their environments and their children may have the exact same characteristics and they may not report them because they don't notice them. So mother reports have been criticized. And there are some temperament instruments that older children and adults, older children, adolescents, and adults can use to report on themselves. And so it's also a self-report problem. Clinical observation problems there have been criticisms leveled at clinical observations because many times clinical observers of temperament have a particular bias or agenda that they're working to address. And so they may see certain kinds of characteristics that are consistent with what they want to see and may not see the ones that aren't consistent with what they want to see. And laboratory observation problems are when you bring a child into the lab, you have that child there most of the time, less than an hour. And you're presenting the child with certain stimuli designed to elicit certain emotional reactions, like a scary clown mask or a physical restraint of some kind. And then what they display at that moment is defined as their temperament, except that they might be sleepy, they might have just woken up, they might be hungry. And so all of these state problems are going to interfere with your trait definition of temperament. So fortunately, we have a starting point, and what I have here is a picture of the front page, the first page, of one of the famous articles of Thomas, Chess, and Birch. This one is, I'm going to say this one's 1970, but they have a whole bunch of publications throughout the 60s and 70s, which all sort of describe the same characteristics. In fact, one of their studies appeared in my book, 20 Studies That Revolutionized Child Psychology. Their 1968 study with Thomas, Chess, and Birch, which defined temperament for the field, was rated by child and infancy scientists as the number 15th most revolutionary study published since 1970. So it's a very popular article, and it defined a field. It started a field. And if you know anything about psychology, you're probably aware that in the 60s, we were still, as a field, suffering from behavioral domination, behaviorist domination. Basically, the world is filled with people who are driven by stimulus and response associations. There's no individuality, there's no uniqueness. Everybody is trained through their environment and through the reinforcers and punishers that they experience throughout their lives. So they challenged that. They sort of helped, I would say, overthrow that, the behaviorist viewpoint, certainly in child psychology and child psychiatry. And my book chapter for Thomas, Chess, and Birch is called, If You Were Born First, We Would Have Stopped. All right, so some of the details, the study they reference in this famous article was the New York longitudinal study. It's a study that they started in 1956 and continued through 1956 through 1988. It's on the next page. Thomas and Chess were married. They were child psychiatrists. They were husband and wife research team. And they had three goals. They wanted to identify why there was rarely, according to behaviorists, there should be a one-to-one correspondence between the environment and behavior, and there weren't. So Thomas, Chess, and Birch and other colleagues wanted to find out why there wasn't. Why were children differentially susceptible to environmental stressors? Children responded differently to stress in their environment. Why would that be? And then why are genetically related siblings so different from one another, even though they have the same genes, or at least 50% of the same genes, and the same parents as Rachel and Sarah in the beginning. They studied 136 children, there it is, 1956 to 1988, for 32 years. roughly even in gender. And they identified a clinical sample, which were called, they were defined as having a significant degree of behavioral disturbance, which was broadly defined, but included delays in language, perceptual and motor development, self-destructive behaviors, flouting of social conventions, persistent bullying, and failure in school without having intellectual deficiencies. In the study, they administered IQ tests to the children. They talked to the parents, usually open interview formats, about their children, about their child rearing attitudes. They went to the nursery schools. They used to call them nursery schools. We call them preschools today. And watched the children with each other. They asked the parents and the teachers to describe how those individual children would respond to transitions throughout the day. Transitions like nap time, going to bed, eating, and toileting. Transitions are the hardest things throughout the day for children to navigate. And some children handle transitions well and others don't. And so they interviewed parents about their children and the teachers, children's ability to do the transition. As a result of the interviews, they came up with their famous 9-dimensional definition of temperament. And so with each one of these characteristics, what I'll call a subdimension, I've presented to you a question which might be an adult analog of the child behavior. So the idea is that you read it and you can answer it for yourself, and that would tell you if you would have been high or low. There's no validity to this. It's just something to help you connect. So the first aspect of temperament, activity level, is basically how fast and often does the child engage in behaviors reflecting muscle movement. So it's physical activity level. And if you're the kind of person who bounces your leg when you cross your legs, or if you twiddle your thumbs, you're that kind of person, you're probably high in activity level. Rhythmicity is how regular are bodily functions. For you, if you go to get sleepy about the same time each day, you go to the bathroom about the same time each day, you're probably high in biological rhythmicity. Approach and withdrawal. How do you like novelty? Do you like new things? Do you not like new things? My characterization of this is, do you like to try new foods? Squid ink, for example. You like new cities, exotic cities. Would it be really fun for you to go to Singapore, just for an example, at random? Adaptability. How well can a child adapt to a change in plans, to a change in something? Especially if the thing that you were going to do was what you were expected and something that you wanted. And a best example I can come up with this for an adult would be, and you might have had these experiences, you're getting ready to go somewhere, and the example I gave was you're going to the movies with your friends, you're on your way to see a movie that you want to see, Black Panther, maybe, and on the way your friends say, oh, no, let's not go to the movie, let's go hiking. And you're like, I don't want to go hiking. Of course, you don't say that probably. You could have a temper tantrum. How do you adapt to that? Do you go along with it easily? Do you develop strategies to regulate your behavior? Okay, if you are, then you would be high in adaptability. When you react, how intensely do you react? So that could be positive or negative. You could, when you get happy, you could be extremely intense or mildly intense, or negative. You could be extremely intense or mildly intense. So the example is, do you blow up when you find out something that upsets you? Do you just explode? Threshold of responsiveness. How intense a stimulus has to be before a child notices it? Are you the kind of person that if a person next to you is tapping their pencil, that you hear it and it bothers you? So you have a low threshold of responsiveness, that you can detect it, so you're highly sensitive? Or somebody is sniffing. I've had cases where, I'm a professor, I give exams in class, and when the students are taking the exams, you can see when they're making faces at each other, because you're just watching them to make sure they're not cheating. And sometimes somebody will have a cold or a flu or something, and they're sniffing, and then the person next to them is really annoyed, and they look up, they roll their eyes, and nobody else notices the person sniffing, but that one person notices it. So, if you are that kind of sensitive person, then you would have a low threshold of responsiveness. Quality of mood. Now, this was defined as being negative. according to them. Quality itself is agnostic about being negative or positive, but if you score high in the quality of mood dimension, that would mean you had high negative mood. So the example of this for you would be, does anybody ever call you Negative Nancy or Grumpy Gus? They might not to your face, but they might behind your back. And if they do, then that would suggest that you are more negative in mood. The last two are different in kind than the others because they have to do less with affect and more with attention, cognition. So I want to point out that these last two dimensions are really cognitive dimensions of individual difference. Distractibility is how easily interrupted you are when you're doing something. So for example, you would be low in distractibility if you get so absorbed in a task that you lose track of time. You might spend a whole day engaged in something and you don't even realize that the time had passed. So you're not very distractible. Things are not interrupting your train of thought. Versus, which a very similarly defined concept, attention span and persistence. This is one category, but it has two parts to it. And this is staying engaged with a task with or without external interference. So even if you do get interrupted, you go back to the task. This is bad if you have a child who is crying, because you might distract them from crying. Suppose they got hurt. You can distract them from it. And they stop crying for a moment, and then they realize, oh, I'm supposed to be crying, and then they go back to crying again. So that would be an example of high persistence. An example for you would be, are you able to engage in unrelated text conversations with friends or family while you're doing another task? Is that easy for you? Then you would be low in persistence. So those were the 9 dimensions that they originally defined in their landmark revolutionary study. And now we can think of this as a 9-dimensional space to define individuality. When they talked about something called active behavior disturbance, today we would call it externalizing psychopathology. It's basically the same thing. They did not use that terminology, but that's pretty much what they meant. And children who were in the clinical group who had externalizing psychopathology were the children who had these temperamental characteristics. They were high in activity level. So they're running around, kind of like uncontrollably. You can imagine the child who is the parent. I don't know if they still do this, but we used to have a little leash that we could put on our child's wrist. We could attach it to our stroller so that they won't run off like at a moment's notice and disappear. It was a child with high activity level might need a leash like that, although it was weird to have one, but we did. Intense in reactivity, less adaptable, that is, they don't like novelty. They stay engaged for long periods of time. Now that can be a positive characteristic unless it's a negative thing that you're doing persistently. So if you're bullying other children and you're doing it persistently, that's bad. We tend to think of persistence as a positive cultural characteristic, but it needn't be if you're doing a negative or a bad thing. Children who are sensitive, the slightest little environmental change they can detect, and they're high in distractibility. Internalizing psychopathology, what they called a passive behavior disturbance, were characterized by these temperamental characteristics. Children were low in activity level. They didn't move. They stayed in one place. They were negative in mood. So these kids high in anxiety. And what they found was that the kids which they defined as having passive behavior disturbance, were kids who actually started out better than the normals and then became worse than the normals. And the definition of better and worse basically is how much of the temperament characteristic did you have. So the temperament characteristics were all characterized so that one end was a good thing and one end was a bad thing. And so if you had too much of anything in the bad direction, that was considered bad. So too much activity is bad. Too much adaptability is actually reverse scored in their scale. So if you have a high score on that, means you're unadaptable. It will drive you crazy if you're trying to present statistics on it. You have to remember that it's reverse scored. So they had kids in their internalizing group who actually started out more rhythmic than normals and then became less rhythmic than normals over time. They also started out with greater interest in novelty and then didn't like novelty. They started out with, they were insensitive to the environment and became super hypersensitive to the environment over time. So they characterized these kids as starting out as better than normal and then transitioning to being more sensitive, being worse, basically, having temperamental problems. Perhaps their most famous definition, Thomas Chess and Birch, was the characterization as children as difficult or easy. And they actually had a specific definition of difficult and easy. And the definition of difficult temperament was opposite of the definition of easy temperament, which is good because if you remember one of them, then you can remember the other one. You don't have to learn two different sets of dimensions. But children who were defined as above the mean on all 5 of these temperament characteristics that you see on the left side were the children classified as difficult children. Now I put the term mother killers in there because that was Stella Thomas's quote, not mine. I'm not saying that they're mother killers. I'm saying that she would use that in her talks to describe these children. They were terroristic in order to their parents and very difficult to raise. High withdrawal, so they were afraid of anything new. They would go to the bathroom at different times throughout the day, which is a problem if you've ever had a child. I teach this to my students and they don't have children mostly. So they're like, why is that a problem? Like, try to take your kid out to a restaurant sometime. And you don't know when it's going to happen that you have to change a diaper. That's really stressful if you're the parent. It's also really stressful if you are, your children's high in mood, a high negative mood all the time. So they're always unhappy. They're going to blow up. They're going to cry. They're going to have a fit. High intensity reactions, when they do react, regardless of the nature of the reaction, it's usually high in intensity. And then the opposite of that is for easy children. So these are children who are adaptable. They're not afraid of new things. They're willing to change. If something happens where you're going to change in a new direction, like you're going to go to McDonald's and then you decide you're going to go to Burger King, and they're okay with that. They're generally happy. They have a positive mood. And they go to the bathroom at the same time every day. They get sleepy at the same time every day. You can count on them being able to take a nap when you need them to. A third category that they came up with is slow to warm up. And these are children who are initially high in withdrawal. At first, they might hide behind a parent's leg when you go to a party or you go to a new event. But eventually, they become normal. So they just take a little while to warm up. So which is good? Is it good to be difficult? Is it good to be easy? If you ask most parents what kind of child they want, they would say they want a child who can chill. We have a culture of chill. We value children who are easy. We want an easygoing child. There's lots of reasons, though, that can be problematic. Easy children aren't all they're cracked up to be necessarily. Which baby of these two are you more likely to respond to with urgency? You're probably going to pick the one on the right? If you're all things being equal and one kid is fussing and the other one is not fussing, you're going to respond to the kid who is fussing. So when you say which is valued as far as temperament goes, it depends on what you're talking about. If you want an easy life where you're not disrupted, you want an easygoing child. But if you're talking about actual survival, then you might want a difficult child, because a difficult child is going to have a problem when they're starving. There was a classic study, this is often cited by Martin DeVries, 1984. He went into to Africa and measured the temperament of children in a Maasai tribe. Maasai is a nomadic African culture, and identified 20 children as either easy or difficult. Now he originally went in, he was going to do a longitudinal study, and what happened was there was a drought and the tribe wandered off. I mean, they had to go where there was food and water, and he lost track of the tribe for a while, then found the tribe, and then wanted to see how the children were doing. And what he found was that there were originally 7 easy babies. He found 13 of the families. 7 were easy, 6 were difficult, and the majority of the easy babies had died, and the majority of the difficult babies had survived, suggesting that temperamental difficulty has survival value in times of extreme stress. There is some value to it. So whether you value difficult temperament or easy temperament depends on your situation. If you're not starving, it's probably okay to have an easy child. But I will tell you, and this isn't in the slides, temperamentally difficult babies, when you identify them as temperamentally difficult in the first 6 months, there have been a few studies showing that they have higher IQs in later childhood. And that's all I'm going to say, because it gets really complicated after that. Another characteristic or concept that Thomas, Chess, and Birch are famous for was the concept of goodness of fit. The extent to which temperamental profile is good or bad for the child depends on the environment that they're in. So if the parents are insensitive to the child's need, then a difficult child could suffer. If you have parents who are sensitive to a difficult child and try to provide for a difficult child, then there's a better goodness of fit. So children are more likely to do well, to prosper, to thrive in environments where their parents are responsive to their needs. Now, the problem with temperament is that most people think that temperament is the fault of the parents. If you have you're a spoiled child, your child has a fit on the floor in the grocery store because they want some kind of food product that you're not going to buy them, they have a temper tantrum on the floor, then you're a bad parent. And so a lot of times parents think that their children's temperamental difficulty is their fault. And I suppose it's possible that they have done things that will cause a child to have a temper tantrum. But we also know that that temperament isn't the parent's fault. Children are born with temperament, a particular temperamental profile. And it wasn't anything that the parents did. And so if you could stop the parent blaming and get parents to recognize that their children are born that way, then the idea is that parents will be more accommodating to the children, provide the kinds of environments that will allow, especially the difficult child, to survive. So even though I said if you're in a drought in Africa, being difficult is good, being difficult is not good in a school system where you have to get along with your peers. And you're not competing with your peers for resources. If you're difficult in that environment, that's kind of bad, and people aren't going to like you. And teachers are going to time you out and in some cases, tell your parents that they have to pull you out of school because you're too disruptive. Okay. So Thomas, Chess, and Birch were famous for creating the construct of temperament, for making legitimate the idea that children can differ from one another through no environmental influence. They pushed back against behaviorist models of child development, and they suggested that temperament may be predictors of childhood psychopathology. They were problems from their research because their findings were based on mother report. They were based on the clinical judgments of the child psychiatrists. And one of the biggest hangups, I think, from the point of view, theoretically, of Thomas and Chess, is that Thomas and Chess called the children with temperamental profiles, they described it as a behavioral style. So saying something is a behavioral style is not very helpful when you're trying to figure out where it came from. It's agnostic. Calling children with a particular temperamental profile is agnostic about where they got it. And they're very adamant that this Thomas and Chessians, I guess, the offspring of Thomas and Chess, the scientists who still adopt that approach, are very adamant about not attributing a particular temperamental style to anything. It's just a behavioral style. So it leaves me hanging. So this is a chart. I did a database lit search in PsycInfo with looking for the word temperament in the abstract. And what this shows is that temperament research has become really popular. My wife pointed out that all research has become really popular. And so like there's just more studies out there. Okay, that's true, but there's also more temperament studies out there. And so this is what you see on the rightmost that says 5,024. There are 5,024 studies with the word temperament in the abstract published between 2008 and 2017. Try to stay on top of that. So there's an alternative model of temperament. This happens to be the one that I've adopted. I'm not saying the other one's wrong. I just like this one better because it links children's temperament to neurobiological underpinnings. It links it to the brain. And so Mary Rothbart, her research has really focused on looking for areas of the brain that would be responsible for these different kinds of temperamental characteristics. And she's done a lot of work with Michael Posner, one of the more prestigious brain researchers that are out there. And so they're trying to actively attribute it to something neurobiological, which is better for me. It's more grounded, allows me to connect with it better. In 1981, she published her, I guess it'd be the first study on temperament. She had the idea that she wanted to measure temperament. That's what psychologists like to do. We like to measure things. She started out with the idea that she was going to have a better measure of the Thomas and Chess dimensions, which they talked about. She wanted to use parent report. She wanted a checklist, and so you didn't have to spend an hour interviewing parents and teachers. You just give them a checklist, they check it off, and then you would have an index of children's temperament. It would be internally reliable statistically, and the temperament dimensions would be distinct, empirically distinct. Some of Thomas and Chess's, which were defined clinically, need not have been distinct dimensions. You could argue that many of them had a lot of overlap with each other. And Rothbart wanted to have dimensions which were very different empirically. So her approach was to develop a checklist, to ask parents to think back, and it depends on the age of the child, but think back in this case, the last week, and without having any knowledge of what's typical, like does your child cry more than other babies? Her approach was, we don't want to ask parents to make a judgment about how their child fared compared to other children, but just does your child do this behavior and how much? And so all of the items on the original infant behavior questionnaire were laid out that way. Does your child do this behavior and how much? And so there was a 7-point scale ranging from never to always, or does not apply. For example, when being undressed, how often did your baby wave her arms and kick? In Rothbart's research, she found that some of Thomas and Chess's dimensions didn't work empirically. So she threw out threshold of responsiveness, rhythmicity, and intensity of responsiveness. In one of the scales, the adaptability scale, remember, is the ability to change directions, ability to tolerate directions. Some of those dimensions in the Thomas and Chess original report were about soothability. How easy can you get your baby to stop crying when your baby is upset? And she found that those soothability items hung together pretty well, but the rest of the items didn't. So she dispatched with the adaptability, the adaptability scale, and created a new scale called soothability. And then she also added a new dimension called smiling and laughter, which isn't necessarily the opposite of fear. And in fact, what we'll see later on is you can think of smiling and laughter as one dimension and fear as another dimension. And you could be high on both of those temperamentally or low on both of those. They're not opposite ends of the same pole. In her infant behavior questionnaire, she came up with 6 dimensions: activity level, smiling and laughter, fear, distress to limitations, soothability, and duration of orienting. I'm not going to go through each one of these. They largely overlap with the Thomas, Chess, and Birch ones, but pay particular attention to the first one, which is basically biological movement. Doesn't reflect any sort of emotionality. And the last one, which has to do with attention. Variability in attention span is temperament. We don't always think about it that way. We don't usually teach it that way. I remember submitting a study when I was talking about variability in attention in the introduction, And then I started talking about temperament, and it was rejected because the person said, well, this isn't temperament. And I was like, well, yeah, it is. And it was like, oh, so you don't know that we call this temperament. So then it occurred to me, I always have to be clear that individual differences in attention span, duration of orienting refers to attention span. You have to tell people that we're defining that as temperament. It's one of multiple dimensions of temperament. So notice that there are 6 dimensions. So now we're in 6-dimensional space to talk about temperament. What I like most about the Rothbardian approach to temperament is there are 3 key elements. The definition from Rothbard's point of view is constitutionally based individual differences in reactivity and self-regulation. That's really awesome. Constitutionally means that it's biological. You're born with it. It's very clear where it comes from. It's not some agnostic definition of behavioral style. You're born with it. And it's influenceable. Okay? You're not stuck with what you're born with. It can be influenced through your own experiences, through maturation. So using the Thomas and Chess idea of goodness of fit, if you're born with a difficult temperament, it can be changed if the parents are responsive to the children's needs. So for example, you might teach children self-regulation skills. You don't just throw a temper tantrum, you control it. It's okay to control it, and here's how you do it. You can change it, is the point. Reactivity and self-regulation are really important conceptually because reactivity refers to, I generally think of reactivity as sort of the natural biological experiences of emotion and movement, whereas self-regulation has to do with attention, which is cognition. So to me, it divides temperament into sort of bodily experiences and cognitive experiences. That's a really nice way to think of the interactions between them.
Wally, I'm wondering if you can just go back a little bit to the previous slide where you talked about temperament, you can change temperament. Do we change temperament, or do kids learn to cope with their temperament? Like, I always thought it was fixed, but kids learn to cope with whatever their temperament was.
I think that the argument would be that you can change temperament. Okay. No temperament theorist would say that it's fixed. They would all say that you can. It would take some work, and it depends on what specifically we're talking about. But for example, if you are incredibly fearful in general, you can overcome that through particular kinds of self-regulation. So it's not like you have more fear and you're just coping with it. You're actually removing the fear. You're not fearful about things anymore. That would be the argument. So these are so she's been busy. Basically, her and her students have published all of these infant behavior, I should say, temperament questionnaires. The IBQR is a revised version of the infant behavior questionnaire. It's got 14 dimensions. So we were at 9, we went to 6, now we're at 14 with babies. The ECBQ is the early childhood behavior questionnaire. That takes you up to 18 dimensions, kind of getting out of control. The CBQ, the child behavior questionnaire, which is for children who are older than preschool, but not middle childhood, so roughly 3 to 8-ish. The middle childhood questionnaire, the early adolescent temperament questionnaire revised, and the adult temperament questionnaire. A real common question at this point, when you start talking about temperament in adulthood, it's like, well, what's the difference between temperament and personality? And sometimes people will say they're the same thing, and they're not the same thing. Personality, I would argue, and I'm not sure if all my colleagues would agree with this, but personality is what emerges in the context of the interaction between temperament and culture, of that culture and the temperament, that biological temperament that you're born with. Personality is what emerges. So you can talk about the big 5, which I'm far from an expert on. I don't think I could even say what all the 5 dimensions are. But they are different, and temperament is usually regarded as the biological substrate of personality. So they ought to be related, but they're not the same construct. And I'm friends with most of these folks on here, so I've had the opportunity to talk to them about their development of these instruments. Okay, so I'm not going to defend this. I'm just going to say this is what it is. When you get up to 15, 17, 18 dimensions, now you're talking about 18-dimensional space. You're trying to describe an individual along 18 dimensions simultaneously, which is impossible. We're not capable of understanding like more than about 4 dimensions, maybe 5 for the super genius ones among us. So what do? Well, you simplify it. And so what Rothbard and colleagues have done was factor analyze their dimensions to generally come up with these 3 factors, or you can call them global dimensions, or you can call them broad dimensions, or you can call them overarching dimensions, and I prefer to call them superdimensions to describe the fact that they are above the subdimensions. Whatever your preference. They've been described all these ways, but there's 3 of them. And each one of these is made up, factor analyzed, of a subset of various numbers of the subdimensions. Surgency, negative affectivity, effortful control. If you're a temperament theorist, then the word surgency is not new. It's a fun word that you can say that nobody else understands what it means. So I'm going to give you a quote here. I really like this quote. It captures what surgency is. It's sort of outgoingness, which could include aggression, or it could include impulsivity. It could include positive affect to novelty. So I'll just read it. Surgency system in humans may be analogous to systems subserving appetitive behaviors in mammals, involved in search, foraging, and investigatory activities, as well as the seeking of reward. So that surgency means outgoingness, surgent. The insurgents attacked the city at dawn. I don't know. You know, the people who go into the city to attack it, they're going outward. So children have some surgency, and they differ along that dimension. So kids can be very high in surgency, can be low in surgency, but it really characterizes 2 general dimensions, some of which is positive emotion, and some of which is outgoingness, like physical outgoingness. Activity level is a characteristic of surgency. Negative affectivity is easy. That's just how negative you are. It characterizes dimensions such as fear and sadness, intensity of negative reactivity. And effortful control is the cognitive piece of this, the ability to regulate through attention other dimensions. It's probably, arguably, for me, the most important dimension because it's considered a control dimension because it can control the other 2. You can control your surgency, you can control your negative affectivity. So developing that is really important, and but we differ. We're born into the world with different amounts of it. So some children are high in attention span, some children are low in it. You can develop it, you can improve it, and when you're really good at it, you can override negative affectivity. So you can prevent negative affectivity from being displayed if you're high in effortful control. If you're low in negative affectivity, then you don't have to worry about controlling your negative affectivity because you don't have a lot of it and you're not going to get into social problems anyway. Yeah.
So then when I think about this, especially when you talk about things like negative affectivity, temperament can change. So I think about kids, for instance, who have been through a lot of trauma, little children who have experienced trauma, neglect. So is it fair to say that a child's environment influences the expression of these dimensions of temperament?
Absolutely.
And that when we're looking and trying to understand kids who have been through that kind of trauma, we need to think about, because the behaviorists will say, sorry, I shouldn't say that. Some people might say, this is just a badly behaved kid, right? But when you look at some of the relational trauma that these kids have been exposed to, you can't help but think when you look at it this way, that their environmental experiences have brought out certain, have amplified the expression of certain aspects of their temperament, which I don't think we think about right now.
Children aren't, if you have the same toxic, stressful environment, 2 children can come out of that very differently.
Sure.
As a result of what they were given at birth. And it's not through their fault. It's nobody's fault. I give the sort of philosophical question to my students to think about this sometimes. Let's suppose you have a mother who's right on the edge, like single mother, trying to care for her child, working really hard, trying to make sure her child gets everything that the child should have. Now let's consider, and she's right on the edge of freaking out and maybe exploding herself. Which child is more likely to push that mother's buttons so that she hits the child, say? Yeah. The child who's temperamentally difficult or the easygoing child? And students will say, oh, the difficult child. I'm like, so is it the child's fault that it was hit by the mother? And they don't want to say that. Nobody would want to say that. Is it the child's fault? Well, that's sort of, you're kind of attributing intention. It's not anybody's fault. It's just what happens. This mother's on the edge. And if you have a child who's just too intense, too negative, running around, the mother could go over the edge. What we in the old days would have called upper control parenting techniques. So over the top parenting techniques. And it's really nobody's fault, but those children are bringing it out because of their temperament more than other children are bringing it out.
How much can adaptability change based on upbringing or the different dimensions? And how likely is temperament to remain stable, like across?
Temperament is highly stable. The definition of stability is that you maintain your rank in a distribution over time. And children, it's highly stable. I mean, you're not going to, if you're extremely high in negative temperament, you may not always be extremely high. You might be middle later on. But as a characteristic, temperament is pretty highly stable. The longitudinal study by Kagan, Snidman, Resnick showed that the children who were identified as infants as they use the term reactive, not difficult, but the 10% most reactive children at 4 months of age as college students were still 10% of the most reactive kids. So that's 20 years later. The first question had to do with adaptability, can you change adaptability? Yeah, well, so you get into the theory, and the idea is that the theory suggests that the overriding factor is, in Rothbard's theory, is effortful control. The ability to override positive or negative reactivity. And so the idea is if you develop effortful control, which there ought to be techniques, so the research is weak on that, but people are trying to develop interventions which strengthen effortful control. The idea is that if you can do that, then children will learn strategies maybe to apply when they're having this reactivity, however you define it, in terms of biological activity level or emotional reactivity level. So it ought to be amenable to intervention. It's certainly possible from the theory, but the research is weak on that piece. There's only a very small number of studies that have focused on that. Okay, and I'm not going to spend much time here. So here's how you would define, using the Infant Behavior Questionnaire Revised, here's how you would define those three overarching dimensions. Basically, you get the measures on the subdimensions and you take the average of those, and then that's their surgency score, their negative affectivity score, and their effortful control score. So just to compare the two, and Thomas and Chess talks about a behavioral style, whereas Rothbard doesn't talk about a style. She talks about it as coming from biology. Thomas and Chess really like to use their clinical judgment. Now, not them per se, but the group of people, ones that I've met, value clinical judgment more highly than empirical associations. I've been to, there's a conference called the Occasional Temperament Conference. It's not occasional, it's every 2 years. And I've been to that, and you have this sort of the Thomas and Chess people, and then you have the Rothbardian people, and they have completely different temperament agenda. And they don't even understand each other's questions, I think, most of the time. It's really fascinating from a scientific point of view. One thing I've noticed, the Thomas and Chess, I call them offspring, because I don't know that they were students per se of Thomas and Chess, but Bill Carey is one of the lead developers of the Carey instruments, and his colleague Sean McDevitt, who is a psychologist. Bill Carey, I believe, is a pediatrician. They have a set of instruments that they can use that are also maternal report, but they cost money. So I don't think they're especially expensive, but you have to pay for them to use them. And Mary Rothbard makes her instruments available free. You just need to let her know that you're using them, because occasionally they might come to you and ask to look at your data, maybe use some of your data in their projects. Okay, so here's a summary of temperament. I'm going to speed up a little bit. Children differ from one another from birth onward along some number of dimensions ranging from 6 to 15-ish. One of them had 18 on a couple slides ago. Some of these dimensions influence other dimensions, particularly the ones involving attention, are control dimensions. And think of, the third point, think of attention as a dimension of difference in the, under the umbrella of temperament. Okay, I'm going to switch gears. Word learning. So here's a primer on word learning. These are milestones. They're not absolute. Okay, children vary quite a bit, but on average, children are understanding their first words around 8 months of age. They're expressing communicative intent. They can't talk at 9 months of age, but they are intending to communicate, and we know that they're intending to communicate, lots of research, at about 9 months of age. They're producing their first words at about 13 months of age, and they're producing their first sentences of, when I call a sentence, is putting two words together, at around 20, 21 months of age. You might have heard about the vocabulary explosion at around 18 months of age. Some people are saying that's fake news. I hate using that term, but it's probably a good application. People are suggesting that there really isn't a vocabulary burst. Vocabulary burst sort of is defined as a non-linear, sort of sudden increase. And other people suggested that that's not a real thing. So it doesn't really matter to me, but that's also in here. That's usually around 18 months of age. How do babies learn words? All right, well, I mean, we don't know. We're guessing about a lot of this stuff. But consider the semantic triangle. So the semantic triangle is the idea that somebody in the world, a sender, is sending a connection between a concept and a label for that concept. And so here's a depiction of a person saying the word cat. So the idea, the person has, at the top, it says sender's idea. The person has the idea of a cat. They see a cat in the world, and they label it a cat for a child. So they're presenting an association between a thing, an object, or it could be an action, and the label for that object or action. And children detect that. Okay, if they're not paying attention, they're not going to learn the word. So over time, children are exposed to lots of application of the word cat, lots of different cats, lots of variations on cats. In the zoo, a big cat might be a lion, and they learn that cats can sometimes be lions, and so on, right? So it's like something like this has to happen, we think, but we're not really sure in the brain what's going on. Some studies have made some good progress in helping us understand how children learn to talk, how they learn to, at least how they learn to apply labels to concepts. But the key here is they have to pay attention to it. All right, so there is, out there in the environment, there is an association being presented to them, usually with a social partner. It could be the mother, it could be a peer, it could be a teacher, could be Sesame Street. Although we know that if you play Sesame Street to kids that's in a non-interactive way, they don't really learn words. You really have to tune it to the children's own activities. I'll also say there's absolutely no evidence that Sesame Street causes language delay. Okay, the research isn't there. Some people are trying to make the claim that exposing children to television causes language delay. There's not much evidence there. There might be some correlational data there, but correlation doesn't equal causation. Okay, so there's three sort of general approaches to explaining how children learn to talk. The first is a basic associationist approach, that children detect an association between a symbol, could be a word, could be a sign, and an object, what we call a referent. So there's something that refers, and there's a thing that is referred to, and children detect that. And from this approach, children are built to detect associations. Their brains are good association detectors. And language isn't special. This all-purpose association contingency detecting brain is good at learning words, and it's also good at learning any kind of association. Language isn't special. So here's sort of a depiction of what an association, a pure association approach might look like.
So this is the iCode robot, and today we're going to teach it the names of some objects. Up here, a truck and a ball. So let's see how we go.
Ball.
Truck.
Truck.
Orange ball.
Science ball.
Orange truck.
Science truck.
So when children learn the names of objects, those objects don't have to be in sight. It can be through association. So we'll show you how that works on the robot. We'll show an object. Then we can hide the object. Say, piano.
Piano.
And say, find piano.
Science piano.
That's correctly said.
Okay, so you get the sense that this robot is learning to detect the association between a label and a thing. But there's some pretty significant problems with this pure associationist approach. For example, where did the robot get the idea that the labeler was intending something? Like, how did the robot know that the speaker meant to label an object? That must have been hardwired somehow in that robot, somehow. And you know, you can imagine with a robot, you're programming the robot to know that that's going to happen. With children, not clear that they're programmed to make word-object associations. So it's a little harder. And also, I really like the second piece. He said that robots learn, this iCub robot learns the word through association. So he shows the piano to the robot, manipulates it, puts it behind him and says piano. Well, I mean, if you did that with a kid, the child might pick up that association. It might not. It depends on what you're doing. And there are limits. And in fact, it turns out there's a whole nother area of research, which we'll call the social pragmatic theory, that says that children look to see the intention of the labeler to figure out what's being labeled. So there is research out there that will show you present a kid with two objects. You can give one object to the kid and you keep one object, and these are usually novel objects, and you label one of them, and which object you're looking at is the one that the kid learns the label for. In time, if I'm looking at an object and I label this a DAX, and the child has another object, and he's looking at his object, but I'm labeling what I'm looking at, if the child were to make a simple comparison based on association, that would be an erroneous mapping. It'd be a mapping error. They would map it onto their object and not to the object that I intended. And it turns out children don't just do pure associations. They do pay attention to what the intention of the social partner does. And there's some really fascinating work showing that children use the intentions of the human partner to determine what the label is applying to. It's not just pure association. There's more to it. They know that humans intend, and they know that they need to pay attention to those intentions to figure out what the intention is in order to make the label. So association goes a long way in explaining word learning, but it doesn't go all the way, and we need some other theories like the social pragmatic theory. There's also a group of theories out there we could call constraint theories, and constraint theories posit, this is we don't know that these constraints exist in children's brains, but they posit there are constraints. We don't know how they get there, but children must have them. For example, if you're going to label an object, how do you know that the labeler is intending to label the whole object and not a part of the object, or an action of the object, or a color of the object? You just say, we have a whole object, the whole object assumption. It's just, the kid has it. Somehow it's in the brain that when they hear a word, they're going to first apply it to a whole object. And if the whole object already has a name, then they'll apply it to a piece of the object. but they have to have the name for the whole object first. We also have something called, so what I'm referencing here is Quine's conundrum of referential indeterminacy. That's what I'm talking about. When somebody labels something, how do you know what they're labeling? We don't really know. We don't know their intention because we don't speak the language. We're trying to learn the language, so we don't know what they intend. How do we bootstrap ourselves into the language? So these are several kinds of assumptions that children learn. One of these is called the novel name nameless category assumption, N3C. I'll come back to that in a minute. And the idea is that if a child hears a novel object, here's a novel word, they haven't heard a word before, and they see a novel object that they've never seen before, they'll assume that the word was meant to apply to that novel object. It's just a proposed principle to explain how children fast map. Fast mapping means learning a word like on a single exposure or two. And children do this. We can show that they do it in the lab. They'll learn a label with one exposure. If they already have labels for everything else, they'll apply a novel label to a novel object. Here's an example of fast mapping in real time in the lab using mutual exclusivity. Mutual exclusivity is the idea that if an object has a label, then a novel label can't apply to that same, if there's, let me start over. If there are two objects in front of the child and one of those objects has a label that the child knows and the child hears another label, they assume it can't apply to that first object, it has to go to the other one. You can't apply two labels to a single object. That's the mutual exclusivity assumption.
Hey, Andre, I have some things to show you. Do you want to play some games? Andre, hey, look what I have. Look what I have, Andre. There's a blanket here. Andre, there's a blanket here. Can you get the blanket? Ah. Mia, a toma. There's a toma here. Hey, Mia, can you give me the toma?
Okay, so she has never been taught that word before. She'd never seen the object before. She'd never heard toma before, but she immediately assumes it applies. I'm not exactly sure, but I think that the toma was a toilet flapper. When you're choosing, new objects, novel objects, you got to pick things that you can buy in a store to use in your experiment, but also that the child isn't likely to have seen before. I'm not sure, but I think that's a toilet flapper. Okay, so word learning summary. Factors involved in word learning interface with the n-dimensional space of temperament. So what I'm trying to say there is I think I skipped a connection here. When you're going through space, when you exist in the world, and you have n-dimensional dimensions of experience of the world through your temperament, then there are reasons that should impact on your word learning. So for example, if you're not paying attention to the toma, when the person asks you for the toma, you don't learn that mapping. You're not paying attention. If you're crying because the experimenter is new and you don't like new people, then you're not going to follow the instructions because maybe you're not paying attention or you're just too upset to engage in the task. So if you are active, and I had one little boy running around the table trying to teach new labels, and he just gets up off his mom's lap, gets on the table and runs down the table, back and forth on the table, and I'm in the other room, like, Mom, get your kid's on the table. He's probably 2. And like, I'm imagining he's falling off the table, the IRB is gonna come down on me, like, why weren't you controlling your kids better? Well, he's not learning the word either. Because he's running around on the table. So there's lots, using what we know about basic word learning theories, there's lots of reasons we would anticipate temperament to interact with children's ability to learn new words. All right, so now we're getting to my research. So I first became interested in temperament-language relationships as a result of Elizabeth Bates' work. I don't know, I'm going to guess that we don't have a whole lot of language researchers in the audience, but Elizabeth Bates was at one point really interested in the individual differences in language acquisition styles. So some children she described were noun kids, that they focused on nouns in their environments. They were using language to define their world. Other kids were pronoun kids. They were more interested in using language to communicate, so they focused more on learning pronouns. And they used language not as a way to describe the world, they used language as a way to communicate with social partners. So she proposed the idea that, that different kids are using language differently from one another. And so some kids enter language through nouns and other kids enter language through pronouns. That was a real popular idea in the 70s and 80s. And so there's, what I've circled there on the right side is a page in her, I know you can't read it, I don't expect you to read it, but there's a page in there where she found that sociability, which was one of the temperament dimensions that we saw Mary Rothbart had in her 1981 infant behavior questionnaire, correlated with several of the pronoun-y aspects of language. And I thought, oh, okay, that'd be cool. I'm going to study temperament-language relationships. So without any theory, I just thought it would be fun to see if different kinds of temperament were correlated with the two different kinds of word learning styles, the noun-focused kids and the pronoun-focused kids. And I had no reason, theoretically, I was not a temperament researcher at all, but it was just one of those things I wanted to do because I wanted publications and you got to get significant findings and sort of a shotgun approach. You measure a bunch of different things and you see if anything correlates. And it did. So what I found was that we administered temperament to a group of kids at, I believe they were 13 months of age when we administered the temperament questionnaire. It was the Mary Rothbart Temperament Behavior Questionnaire, the original one, not the revision. It had only 6 dimensions. And then we had 2 different kinds of language measures. We had what we called holistic language, those are the pronoun-y kids, and we had analytic language, which are the noun-y kids. And I thought that soothability would be correlated with being pronoun-y, and maybe smiling and laughter would be correlated with being pronoun-y, and that duration of orienting would be correlated with nouniness, or what I call analytic. And that didn't happen at all. In fact, nothing was correlated with holistic language use, the pronoun-y kids. Everything that was correlated with just noun production. So what you see on the rightmost, lower right, is 21-month noun-noun constructions. This is how many 2-word sentences children produced, which both words were nouns. And it was correlated with duration of orienting, smiling and laughter, and soothability. And I have absolutely no idea why that would happen. It didn't make any sense, and I didn't know what I was doing. So this was in 1997. I've spent the last however many years that is trying to figure out why that would be. And it turns out there's lots of reasons, and at the time I wasn't a temperament theorist. Like I said, I discovered this by accident, and it's not what you're supposed to do when you do science. You're supposed to have a theory, and you're supposed to test the theory. And so what I did was I found some findings, and I developed a theory in response to it. And so that's what I've been doing for the last whatever number of years in my life, 22 years, something. And so I tested it again. We wanted to replicate it, so we went to different samples. We got different kids. We used different instruments. Here, what you see here on the left, so Dixon Smith 2000, you see a couple of tables. You don't have to pay attention to the individual things. I'm just showing you that I had tables which showed cool findings, which generally replicated what I had found with Dixon and Shore. Some of these temperament dimensions were correlated with language. Using different instruments. So we used, instead of using the IBQR in this one, we used the Toddler Temperament Scale, which was an offshoot of the Thomas and Chess group before they started charging money for it. And we, instead of using maternal interview of language, we used the child development, the communicative development inventory to measure children's production of words. And we found basically the same kinds of things that we found in Dixon and Shore, was that in this particular case, what you see is the equivalent of duration of orienting was correlated, adaptability, which is sort of inversely related to fear, and mood, quality of mood. So the same kinds of dimensions were correlated. And don't pay attention to the specifics, so just pay attention to this, that children who are higher in attention as rated by parents have larger vocabularies. Children who are more negative in mood have smaller vocabularies, and children who are happy have larger vocabularies. That's just the general picture, without worrying about all these different labels and different terminology. We looked at, so what you saw in the previous slide, this is word production. We looked at the younger kids, and we found the same kinds of patterns of correlation with language reception. These are words that moms say their kids understand when they're 7, 10, and 13 months, not what they're saying. Generally the same kind of finding. All right, so why is this? Again, I'm not a temperament researcher, at least at that point I wasn't. I was trying to figure out why would they be related. Why is temperament consistently related to vocabulary development? I found it in 2 different samples with 2 different co-authors using completely different kids. And so I believed it was a real thing. Now it might be something called common source bias, that you get those same results because mothers reporting on both instruments. I don't think that makes a whole lot of sense, because it's not clear that the mothers know what their kid's temperament is when they say that the kid is waving their arms frequently in the last 2 weeks or last 1 week. And why would they then say that their kid is, doesn't know the word dog? I mean, it doesn't make any sense that they'd be connected, but it is true that the mother is filling out both instruments. And then we began wondering why. If you think about how temperament could be related to word learning, one factor might be that children are, there's a direct approach and an indirect approach. And by direct approach, if a child has to learn a word, they have to pay attention to it. And if they're not paying attention to it, they're not learning the word. Well, why wouldn't they be paying attention to it? One of 2 reasons. Either they're low in attention span, or they're high in negative affectivity. And their negative affectivity is distracting from their ability to pay attention. So that would be what we called a direct route. An indirect route has to do with the effect of temperament on the environment. So an easygoing baby, a baby's got a lot of positive affect, they're going to be babies that you want to play with. So they're going to attract attention from their parents, from social partners, from teachers. I mean, nobody wants to play with a difficult baby. If the baby's grumpy, high negative affectivity, if you're seeing that baby having a fit, you're not going to sit down and want to play with them. You're going to want to soothe them. And you're not going to expose that child to the kinds of language models that an easygoing baby might get when they're waiting to receive the world from their social partner. That's one route. Another route we hypothesized is that temperamental difficulty might negatively impact factors which contribute to children's ability to learn words. And one particular one I'm going to talk about in a second is joint attention. Well, how are you going to measure this? If you're going to test word learning for children who differ in temperament, you can't manipulate temperament. You can't experimentally say, all right, I'm going to want you to be positive in mood, and I want you to be more negative in mood, and I'm going to give you some words, and we'll see what you're learning. You can't manipulate experimentally children's temperament. But I came up with this approach, which was, well, if we can't manipulate their temperament, maybe we could arrange the environment in ways that should theoretically interact with temperament in ways that make sense. And so we developed a protocol called the competition attention paradigm. So we basically measure temperament in a group of children. By now, we're pretty much exclusively using the Rothbard instruments. And then we expose the children to a learning situation. The learning situation can be any kind of learning situation. One of them was a word learning situation. We also had a non-word learning situation in one of the studies. And then while we're presenting children with the word learning situation, we present a competitor for their attention. The idea here is that if a children is high in attention, they'll have more attention to allocate to word learning than children who are low in attention. And so if you distract them, these children, they'll spend some attention paying attention to the distractor, but they'll have some left over to pay attention to the word learning situation or any learning situation. Kids who are low in attention, kids who are low in duration of orienting or persistence, these kids don't have very much attention to begin with for whatever reason. And when they're presented with an environmental distractor, that just sucks their attention completely away from the word learning situation, and they're not going to learn the word or whatever. Or children who are high in, you could go lots of places with this, children who are high in negative affectivity, These are children who are fearful and they're afraid of new things. You could present something with them that might frighten them. It turns out that mechanical spiders don't frighten children, but it frightens their mothers. And the idea that that would raise their negative affectivity. The negative affectivity would decrease the available attention that they have to pay attention to word learning situations. And so there's all kinds of places that you can go with this. So these were the hypotheses that we started out with. So we assessed in Dixon, Sally, and Clements, we assessed temperament using the ECBQ. So this is basically the toddler version, not the infant version. We presented children 2 word learning opportunities using the Mervis and Bertrand 1994 N3C procedure. I brought your attention earlier to the N3C procedure, novel name, nameless category procedure. The idea that children will apply a novel label to a novel object because it's a word learning principle or something. And we did this we tried to teach children 8 words, 2 words at a time over 4 different settings. In a baseline condition, we tried to teach the children these words with no distraction. And in the other 3, we distracted them in different ways, in ways that we thought was ecologically valid. I'm not going to explain the cognitive distraction condition. The social distraction condition, we're teaching the child a word, and a stranger walks in and starts reading green eggs and ham in French. We didn't use English because we didn't want to compete with learning an English word. We just wanted a social person to come in and be frightening. They weren't frightening. They were wearing a white lab coat, and she was very pleasant, actually. But it was a social person who walked in the room in the middle of something else. And children who are high in fear of novelty, you're not going to like that. And they're going to spend all their attention looking at the social or the stranger and not the word learning situation. And then we had we called it mechanical distraction condition, for lack of a better term. We had a Mr. Monkey toy. Mr. Monkey is that mechanical toy who goes like this. And we had that toy sitting up in our room, up on a counter. And it was sitting there quietly the whole session, but it came on conveniently during one of the word learning sessions. Okay, so this is the kind of task we used in the N3C task. I can't move away from the camera. The picture on the left, what you see are mostly words that kids are supposed to know by the age of 21 months. So you see a book. Well, the second thing is a doorstop. They wouldn't know that. That's the novel object. A book, grapes, a car, and a bug. And then in the next tray, what you see is a plane, a honey dripper, an arm, a cookie, and an elephant. These aren't, I posed these for this talk. These aren't the exact ones that we used, but it's the same objects, not necessarily in this pairing. And so we taught the children, like we would say, can you show me the DAX? Give me the DAX. Where's the DAX? And the idea is that on the left tray, they would choose the door stop, and on the right tray, it would have been the honey dripper, because these are not things that they know the words for. And so we had 2 phases. We had a general learning phase where we presented these and looked to see if they chose the DAX. And then we had a generalization phase. So this is called the comprehension phase. The generalization phase, we replaced the original novel object with a new version of that same novel object. So a new doorstop or a new honey dripper. And these are the pairs of the novel objects we use. So on the left, across all the words that we were teaching, on the left you see 2 honey drippers. The top left side are 2 doorstops. The top right are strainers. The lower right are air pressure gauges. Next to those are bottle stoppers, and then next to those are door hooks. So we would train the child on one of the objects and then test the child on another of the objects. So if they learn the word, if they learned that the honey dripper was a DAX during comprehension, then they should extend that to a new DAX when we presented the new DAX in the generalization phase. You don't need to look at this. I think you have this in your handout, but these are the actual comparisons that we used. The label on the left, the novel labels were GIP, TIV, HOD, TUZ, DAX, LEP, NOOP, and BEM. And the novel objects that were labeled were a bottle opener, a honey dipper, a strainer, toothbrush holder, garlic press, tire gauge, pastry blend, and a bottle stopper. And then they were paired with known objects. And this is what, you can't hear this very well, but this is what it looked like.
Madison, can you find the kitty cat? Madison, can you find the cheese? Very good. Madison, can you find the gift? This is the gift. Would you like to play with the gift? It's a neat gift, isn't it?
So we asked the child for the novel object, and whether or not the child picked it, we labeled it 4 times. This is the GIP. This is a nice GIP. Do you like this GIP? It's a GIP, isn't it? So let me just describe what happened there. You give the objects to the child for 30 seconds to let the child become familiarized with the objects. Then you turn on the Mr. Monkey in this case, and the Mr. Monkey was the trigger for the experimenter to label the objects. So that's why you saw her playing with the objects before the experimenter labeled them. Now she's going to label it. And then after that, you're going to see the test trials.
Madison, can you find the keys? Can you find the keys?
So she asked for familiar.
Madison, can you find the tiv?
This is a tiv.
This is the tiv. Would you like to play with the tiv? It's a neat tiv. Okay, Madison. Very good, you found the tiv.
So this is test.
Good job.
In the generalization phase.
Good job.
So she got that one.
Okay, Madison, can you find the tiv? Yeah.
So I'll point out that in this particular trial, the tiv is there and then there's a foil. Because if you put a new tiv and the child chose it, you could argue, well, the child isn't choosing it because it's a tiv, the child's choosing it because it's new. So we put 2 new things. One was a new tiv and then a new thing that they hadn't seen before. In this case, and that was also true in the previous trial, in this case is the door hook is the foil. And this child does not demonstrate knowledge of tiv. Next French fries though.
You've done so great today.
Okay. So, busy graph here. Basically what you see, we measured children's temperament and we divided them in half based on their attention span. The blue bars are children who are low in attentional focus. The red bars are children who are high in attentional focus. From left to right, you see the baseline condition. This is their word learning performance. Baseline is when they weren't distracted. And all the way to the right is the Mr. Monkey condition, which is what you just saw portrayed. And what we were looking for is interaction effects. So we were looking for the extent to which basically the blue bar is lower than the red bar, because the blue bar shows that children perform more poorly to learn a word when they were distracted, when they had a low attention span, compared to children who were high in attention. And what you see here across from left to right are baseline cognitive social distractor in Mr. Monkey. And the only significant effect was with the social distractor. What this showed was that children who were low in attention learned the words more poorly when they were distracted than children who were high in attention. I can go into it. There's a lot more to it than that, but basically, when you collapse the 2 conditions on the right, we call that a sudden distraction, where somebody comes into the room or Mr. Monkey suddenly turns on, and generally children learn more poorly when they're distracted, when they're low in attention. Okay. I'm going to skip some of this here. All right, to summarize. Temperament is a very powerful way to conceptualize individual differences between babies. It's been used very productively in the theory. I told you earlier, I didn't really know how temperament ought to be related to word learning at the time. Since then, I've learned a lot about the theory. In fact, I've developed some of the theory, and it turns out there's lots of reasons why temperament should be related to word learning in ways that are theoretically consistent. It's very powerful because it allows you to simultaneously consider somewhere between 6 and 15, 18 dimensions of temperament, or 3 if you use the overarching superdimensions. But it's also extremely complex. Humans are just not capable of understanding other humans along n-dimensional dimensions simultaneously. You just can't keep that many things in mind at once. But you could if you were very complex. We know that temperament ought to impact language development. We think that it makes sense that positive affectivity would be associated with advanced language because everybody wants to hang out with a positive kid. And if you're hanging out with a positive kid, you're going to interact with them more and talk to them more. And the kind of language that you're going to give them are going to be descriptive language, rather than behavioral control language like you might have with a kid high in negative affect. We found that negative affectivity was associated with delayed language. Makes sense. These kids are not getting the language models that are going to be helpful for language acquisition. And this negative affectivity is probably drawing on the attention that they have to pay attention to word models in the first place. And we found that effortful control is those attention span measures. Children high in effortful control have larger vocabularies. I want to point out that although my lab has found this is also all these findings have been found in multiple other labs. We're probably over close to 15 to 18 studies now showing these same kinds of patterns. Language delay is not necessarily pathological. And what I mean by that, it's not something that you need to intervene with necessarily. I mean, you've got to take into account the whole environment. If you have a child who's not talking by the age of 4, that's probably a problem. I'm not a specialist in speech language pathology, but it sounds to me like that's a problem. But if a child is 2 and they're not talking much, it might be okay. It might be a reflection of their lack of interest in people. If they have a particular temperamental profile that they're not sociable. Temperament may impact how babies learn to talk. It may impact you. The word impact is causal. I don't have any causal studies, but it might be causal. But it might also impact whether babies want to talk. If you're negative, you've low in sociability, if you're low in preference for novelty, new people come in, you don't want to talk to them, and that might be the temperament speaking rather than any sort of intellectual delay. So if a baby doesn't talk, it may just be that you're not interesting enough for that baby. Throughout, I've assumed a temperament to language causal direction of effect. I want to be clear that I've never tested a causal direction of effect. My findings are consistent with it, but not proof of it. There's no reason to think that it couldn't be bidirectional. Language development could influence temperament. You can imagine a case where a linguistically precocious child is easier going because they can communicate their intentions with their social partners better. And they're not as frustrated by their inability to communicate. I can imagine that an easygoing person might be better off because they're more linguistically advanced. It obviously could be bidirectional. I'm not suggesting otherwise. There's no reason, though, to think that that the effect of temperament on learning is linked to first words. It could, I believe, and I've got some studies going on now suggesting that it also affects grammatical development. So by grammar, I'm talking about more advanced language of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-olds. I think that generally speaking, temperament affects babies and children's abilities to pay attention. So it ought to do that regardless of age. I don't think that it's uniquely limited to infants and toddlers. And I don't think it's uniquely limited to language. I think it applies to any form of learning, no matter what you're learning. what are we going to do next? Well, our next steps are to look at moderators. For example, I'm doing a study now where we looked at the relationship between temperament and language as a function of socioeconomic status. So we have kind of a group of families that are well-to-do, and we're looking at another families that are less well-to-do. Their incomes, one group is significantly above the national and state average, the other is significantly below, and the pattern of correlations is different. We think parenting probably makes a difference. I don't want to get into all the specifics of that, but the next steps are really going to be on factors that moderate those, what we'd call zero-order correlations. All right, let's review the learning objectives. So I suggested that at the end of this presentation, you would understand the differences between two popular conceptualizations of temperament. So we talked about the Thomas and Chess conceptualization and the Rothbard conceptualization. I suggested that you might understand mechanisms theorized to underlie vocabulary acquisition. So we spent some time talking about associationist theories, sociopragmatic theories, and constraint theories. I suggested that you'd be familiar with the techniques and challenges of measuring temperament and language in very early childhood. Well, you can't manipulate temperament, but you can interact with temperament in ways that make theoretical sense. You can measure temperament in the lab, and you can measure temperament using maternal report. And then I suggested that you'd be familiar with the scientific literature linking temperament to language in very early childhood. I should have said that you would be familiar with my literature linking temperament to language in very early childhood. But trust me when I say it's been replicated by other labs, by other scientists, not just me. This is my lab. We took this picture just before I came here. So I usually have about 10 people in my lab. Right now, we're not collecting new data. We're analyzing old data, coding old data. And that's it. Any questions?
So one of the interesting questions that has come in, do we know where temperament lives in the brain? And can you speak to the connection of neurobiology?
Okay, people, the affective components of language, the emotional reactivity parts are thought to be in the limbic system, and attention is prefrontal cortex kinds of things, and the anterior cingulate gyrus area. That's all Michael Posner kinds of stuff, but people are attributing it to these kinds of, it's just really hard to do brain neuroimaging with babies and toddlers. We tried to do a toddler study, and afterwards, people said we were stupid for attempting it, but with 2-year-olds, you basically can't put caps on them, like EEG caps. I didn't know that. So I bought an EEG machine and a bunch of caps and was bringing babies into the lab. And they, we had like less than a 40% compliance rate with the caps. And so I found out afterwards, like, yeah, nobody studies EEG in 2-year-olds. It's just a bad age for it. Prior to that, it's okay. And after that, it's okay. But 2 years. So, I mean, that's like the peak word learning time. So the answer is we know a lot less about it during that peak period than we do other ages, but there are people who are theorizing about how it would be linked. I'm just not one of those experts.
And another person has asked around mutual exclusivity and how this might apply to children learning 2 languages simultaneously.
My understanding of children who are learning multiple languages, they tend to apply a word from one language to an object and not another word to that same object. Their vocabulary tends to be the same size overall as a monolingual acquisitioner, but they know fewer words in each language. So like if a child's bilingual in Spanish and English, for example, they would have the same number of words, but they would have them broken down. Many would be in Spanish, many would be in English. And so I think it would be safe to say that if a child knew in English, knew the name of something in English, they would be less inclined to apply, early on, less inclined to apply that a label in Spanish to that same object. They would assume that that label in Spanish would go to something else.
So next question. Can you speak to how temperament and attachment behaviors relate, and can you give an example? You can say no.
So that's actually a theoretical controversy. I used the phrase earlier today to suggest that temperament theorists would say, let's just put it this way. There are some temperament theorists who have suggested that attachment is a myth, that what you measure in the strange situation is, which is how attachment classifications originally started. What you're measuring there is not a relationship measure. What you're measuring is children's temperament. I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just saying that there are theorists who believe that the two concepts are incompatible. Generally speaking, though, when you look at attachment, qualities of attachment using the strange situation, what you find is that some temperamental characteristics are predictive of children's responses during the separation episodes. It's like how much distress they show during separation is predicted by their temperament measurements. But some people would say that, and that's a political argument. Some people would say that there really isn't attachment. What you're really measuring is temperament.
And I'll just ask one final question. So you mentioned earlier some interventions around modifying temperament and
Modifying effortful control.
Yeah, can you give some examples of that, or do you?
Usually it's some sort of vigilance training. So a vigilance task is designed to improve children's abilities to maintain and engage attention. So a task would be, it's usually presented in the form of a video game, children looking at a video monitor, and they're supposed to pick a fish when it's swimming in an opposite direction from other fish. And when they select the right fish, then they get a reward. I don't know exactly what happens. And the idea is that the more they do it correctly, the more rewards they get, the more excited they get more skilled at looking for the fish that's swimming against the other fish. And so some form of vigilance training. The idea is that when you engage in vigilance training, you become more vigilant, and that strengthens whatever neural connections you have that are engaged in attention management.